I think I finally get Radiohead.
Bro, you should check out Elliott Smith.
When it comes to sad boy rock bands, Radiohead is the undisputed king of them all. Originally formed in 1985, Thom Yorke and the boys have been making virgins everywhere crying their pillows since they first broke onto the 90s alt-rock scene. They've also had one of the most radical reinventions in rock history, from starting out as a bunch of British Nirvana wannabes with their breakout single Creep, to making some of the most celebrated albums in music history, with stuff like OK Computer, Kid A, and In Rainbows. Memes aside, I think it's amazing how Radiohead has remained one of the most acclaimed and commercially successful rock bands of all time, with OK Computer changing the landscape of alt-rock for many more years to come, influencing bands like Muse, Coldplay, and Travis. I also really love how versatile the band is in their music, having experimented with electronica, art pop, and orchestral music over the years. They've always refused to just stick to one genre for their entire career, and I think that's enough for me to make a video reviewing all 9 of the band's albums, Gauntlet style. As always, I am not counting live albums, compilation albums, solo works, side projects, remixes, or reissues. Their last 2 reissues got some bangers though. I'm only reviewing the main albums in their discography, from their 1993 debut, Pablo Honey, to their most recent album to date, A Moonshaped Pool. I'm also not going to rank all these albums from worst to best to make it stand out from the other videos talking about Radiohead's discography, and hopefully provide a new perspective on this band by talking about all these albums in chronological order. Time to suck on those lemons, boys and girls. Here's my thoughts on all 9 albums in Radiohead's discography. Ugh, I'm really sorry, guys. We gotta talk about Pablo Honey first. Radiohead's 1993 debut album has become kind of a massive punchline in the band's fanbase, mainly because of how safe this album sounds compared to literally every single album in their discography that came afterwards. Now, while preparing for this video, I decided to listen to this album last so I could get a full grasp of what the band's sound is usually like before going back to their early 90s grunge and alt-rock roots. And let me tell you, given how infamous and how widely mocked this album was by fans and critics and listeners alike, plus the fact that this is considered by many to be Radiohead's worst album, I was kind of scared going into Pablo Honey. And after listening to it in full for the first time, I can confidently say that it's fine. It's perfectly fucking fine. I can understand why a lot of people typically disregard this in the grander scheme of Radiohead's discography, given how derivative and generic this album sounds compared to the other big grunge and alt-rock bands of the time. However, in Radiohead's defense, they were clearly inexperienced making this album. You can tell from songs like You and Vegetable, and even my personal favorite song off this album, Stop Whispering, that they were taking so much inspiration from bands like U2 and REM and the Pixies that they clearly weren't ready to form their own sound yet. So yes, I can definitely understand why so many fans hate this album, and I can also definitely understand why even the band members themselves regret making this album over the years. But if you've ever seen their performance at the MTV Beach House, yeah, you can tell that they hated this from the very start. By the way, I feel like I'm forgetting something here. Anyone Can Play Guitar is actually kinda decent. Is that it? No? Okay, how about Thinking About You? That song's pretty cute, I guess, which is weird saying that about a Radiohead song. Still no? I really have to talk about this one, huh? Alright, fine! I'll talk about Creep. This song is everywhere. Even if you're not a Radiohead fan, you know this song. You've heard it in movies, you've heard it in covers, you've definitely heard it in memes. This is the one Radiohead song that everyone, regardless of gender, age, ethnicity, or race, knows and can sing along to. I know this song gets a lot of crap for being too accessible compared to other Radiohead songs, and honestly, if you think that way, you're gatekeeping, and that's kind of pathetic. This song actually isn't that bad. I'd even consider this one of the best songs of the 90s. I particularly love its lyrics about feeling insecure about yourself, and Thom's vocals do a fantastic job conveying those emotions. I also love Johnny's little guitar noises before the chorus that go And while I've definitely heard far better and far more beautiful Radiohead songs, this one is definitely a great song on its own. Now, it's pretty clear by now that this song is so popular that even the band themselves think it's overhyped. So much so that they've refused to perform the song live until later in their career. That look on Johnny's face says it all. Not too long ago, Thom Yorke dropped a so-called very 2021 remix that's literally just the acoustic version slowed down and stretched to 9 minutes. Nobody hates Creep more than Radiohead themselves. It kind of reminds me of how much the Twilight cast hated working on those movies so much, they started taking on more mature roles after that franchise ended, just so they'd be taken a little more seriously. I get why fans brush this song off as being too mainstream and accessible compared to the band's other work, but honestly speaking, without the success of Creep, and without Pablo Honey, I don't think Radiohead would be as big as they are today. To me, I see Pablo Honey as the band sorta understanding how to make an album and how to make a smash hit before they completely tore down and reinvented those rules, starting with their next album, The Bends. I did not expect to talk about this album for so long. I am so sorry. But what I'm trying to say here is that this album is an otherwise decent grunge and alt-rock album on its own. But considering Radiohead's later works, you can tell this band did not want Pablo Honey and Creep to be their legacy. And this has been a mission that would drive the band creatively and musically for the rest of their entire career. Next on this list is the band's 1995 sophomore album, The Bends, the missing link between the grunge sound of Pablo Honey and the futuristic alt-rock of OK Computer. I don't think this album gets as much love as the band's most acclaimed works, which is a damn shame because I actually have a personal soft spot for this album. I remember when I first got into Radiohead when I was about to turn 14, and there were 2 tracks on The Bends that truly got me hooked into this band's music. Those tracks being Fake Plastic Trees and High and Dry. Both of these songs are not only my personal favorite Radiohead songs, but they're also probably my personal favorite songs ever. And these songs are even more beautiful when you listen to them while you're lying in bed or commuting on a train or a bus in the middle of the night. And back to back, they're like the Kobe and Shaq of this album's track list. Just a beautiful 1-2 gut punch that's guaranteed to make you cry harder than chopped onions. Oh yeah, there's other tracks on this album too. My Iron Lung is incredible. What I love the most about this song is that this was written as a response to the success of Creep, and it stands out as one of the most batshit crazy songs the band's ever recorded. And this song, being the lead single off this album, was more or less a perfect introduction to the Radiohead we all know and love today. There's also the title track and Bones, both of which are filled with so much swagger it could make Oasis blush. Just, which sees Johnny Greenwood channel his inner Hendrix, and Planet Telex and Nice Dream, 2 songs that would go on to forecast what Radiohead's music would sound like later on in their discography. What's also a very beautiful listen is the closing track, Street Spirit Fade Out, which is just so depressing and bleak, and I just love it that way, I guess. You have all these lyrics about dead birds and screaming and fighting for life, and they're all some of the darkest and most direct things Thom Yorke's ever written in a Radiohead song. The album does struggle a bit in its second half though. Bulletproof and Black Star are okay, but Sulk is one hell of a head scratcher. Just like your dad, you'll never change. Huh? But yeah, apart from that, I really love The Bends, and it remains one of my favorite albums from the band. Like it or hate it, there's no denying that this album was a stepping stone for what the band would have in store for the next few decades. Which leads us to widely considered to be one of the greatest albums of all time, and one that paved the way for a new era of alt-rock, OK Computer sees Radiohead at the height of their musical powers. And in a time where the most popular rock bands were all dirty and fast and noisy, Radiohead stood out from this crowd by presenting a clean and abstract and otherwise dystopian take on rock music. One that's very evident from Johnny Greenwood's ethereal guitar work to Thom Yorke's real lyrics. The first half of this album is Radiohead's finest hour as a band, with tracks like the strangely optimistic DJ Shadow-inspired Airbag, the Bohemian Rhapsody-esque Odyssey of Paranoid Android that feels like the musical equivalent to getting into a bar fight while high on LSD, and the terrifying and nihilistic Karma Police, as well as exit music for a film and Let Down, 2 of which are, in my personal opinion, some of the most somber songs in the band's entire discography, and that's saying a lot. There's also the interlude, Fitter Happier, which is this simple but ominous critique about how mundane and cold living in modern society can be every day. This isn't even a song, it's literally just a creepy text-to-speech robot voice saying random shit, and yet it's the one track that pretty much sums up OK Computer in a nutshell. You also have songs like Electioneering, which is probably the most energetic song on this entire album, with its loud and wailing guitars, and in contrast, no surprises, a song that manages to make you comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time, depending on how you feel listening to it. Speaking from personal experience, this album took my breath away re-listening to it. This is an album that manages to be timeless both sound-wise and lyrical-wise, from influencing all those bands that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, to predicting the current state of 21st century society, minus the part where kids watch skibbity toilet videos every day. I know OK Computer's been overhyped with critics, fans, and listeners alike for the past 27 years, but it's one that rightfully deserves all that praise. If you haven't listened to this album yet, even after everything I've said, please pause this video and go listen to it right now. It's a once-in-a-lifetime musical experience, and you won't ever regret it. Okay, time to talk about the Funny Lemon album. Kid A is the album when Radiohead started doing their own thing. And this doesn't just apply to the music on this album, but also to the way the band promoted it. Radiohead did not release any singles from this album, nor did they do a lot of interviews or photo shoots or live performances to promote it, and instead relied on these short animations online to generate word of mouth. Radiohead refused to promote this album so much that when Q Magazine asked the band if they could do a photo shoot for their album, they retaliated by submitting these creepy, digitally altered photos of themselves and challenging them to put them on posters. Imagine being a kid in 2000 and seeing this cover at your local 7-Eleven. I swear, this shit would have scarred me for life. As for the album itself, what you see on the album cover is what you get. An icy, bleak, and dystopian world where everybody's on the brink of self-destruction, slowly growing anxious yet prepared for the end of the world. Or at least that's how I see it anyways. I don't know, Thom literally wrote these lyrics at random. Everything in its right place sets the album's tone right away, with its moody synths and Thom talking about sucking on lemons, and songs like the title track, the ominous ambience of Tree Fingers, and my personal favorite song on the album, Idiotech, expand on Kid A's dark yet strangely comforting and unnerving electronic sound. There are still some songs on here that sound like rock songs. Well, sort of. Like Optimistic, that sounds like an early Nine Inch Nails song with this groovy little breakdown near the end, as well as the national anthem, which sounds so jazzy it almost doesn't even belong on this album, even if it literally ends sounding like a bunch of trumpets trying to kill each other. But it's not a Radiohead album without some total downers. How to Disappear Completely is probably the easiest this album gets on the ears, even if it's also one of the bleakest songs the band's ever made. The same can be said for the album's closer, Motion Picture Soundtrack. On its own, it's a breakup song that's simple yet emotionally crushing. But in the greater context of this album, this is probably the biggest gut punch of an album ender in Radiohead's discography. Like, imagine listening to haunting electronic music for almost an hour straight, and then it ends with a song that sounds nothing like everything else that came before it, and Thom Yorke singing about his own death. Yeah, Kid A is a phenomenal album. The fact an album as crazy as this actually charted to #1 in multiple countries went to show how big Radiohead was by then. It's an album that's continued to garner probably just as much praise as OK Computer over the years, that one guy even thought that this album predicted 9/11. Yeah, sure thing, buddy. And this was pretty much a massive turning point in the band's career, because it went to show that they could do whatever they wanted with their music, and we'd still love it anyway. Oh yeah, they made this one too. Hey, you guys want to hear a funny joke? Why did Radiohead call this album Amnesiac? Because you won't remember it when it's finished. Okay, so before I go ahead and explain why this is kind of weak compared to their other albums, I should first provide some context. So basically, Radiohead recorded a lot of stuff around the time they were working on Kid A, and because of that, they couldn't fit all of these songs into one album. So eventually they had to split it into two, and both albums became completely separate bodies of work from each other. Now personally, I prefer the bleaker and more electronic soundscapes of Kid A over the jazzier and sparser instrumentation of Amnesiac. That's not to say this is a bad album or anything, believe me, it's not, and I don't see it as a collection of Kid A outtakes or B-sides either. My problem with Amnesiac is that it kind of sounds unfinished. There's a lot of highlights on this album for sure. Pyramid Song, You and Whose Army, and the closing track, Life in a Glass House, are all astonishingly beautiful. Knives Out is a haunting tune about cannibalism. Oh, and fun fact, the movie Knives Out got its title from that song because director Rian Johnson's a big Radiohead fan. And I love the simple but eerie breakbeats and packed like something something something. And that's where my positives for this album kinda end. I'm really sorry to say this, but everything else just sounds like a collection of unfinished Kid A demos. Hulk Pour Revolving Doors, okay, I will admit, is actually kinda interesting. I don't think it's as bad as many fans say it is. I actually really love how confrontational that song is with its ridiculously loud distortion, even if Thom Yorke is just going on singing about doors. I swear, he could be singing about pets instead, and it wouldn't make a single damn bit of a difference. There are turtles, and there are hamsters. Hunting Bears and Like Spinning Plates sound like demo songs that somehow made it into the final album. And while these songs aren't bad or anything, I would have loved it if the band did a little more with these two tracks. Also, there's a song called Morning Bell Amnesiac on here. I wonder what that one's about. It's fucking Morning Bell again! Okay, yes, I like its slower tempo and instrumentation. I also like how this song is kind of a link between Kid A and this album. But it's literally just Morning Bell again. The lyrics are the same. The vocals are the same. It just feels like the band mashed them up with an instrumental from a completely different song and called it a day. Overall, if Kid A feels like a main course meal, then Amnesiac feels like the leftovers you bring home and store in your refrigerator. The fresh taste that meal once had is gone. And not even microwaving it can bring that same taste back. Look, I love how gentler and more bare bones this sounds compared to Kid A. But man, I'm sorry, it's just not as memorable or as interesting as its predecessor. This is definitely my least favorite when it comes to Radiohead's 2000s experimental stuff. If you love this album, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I can understand why some people would consider this underrated in the grander scheme of Radiohead's discography. And hey, who knows, maybe it'll grow on me in the near future. But as it stands right now, it's listenable. And that's all I have to say about Amnesiac. Oh, now we're talking! In a time where nearly every big musical act ever was criticizing George Bush and the war on Iraq, Radiohead proved themselves to be one of the better ones, with 2003's Hail to the Thief. Let's face it though, the competition wasn't that fierce.
I'm drinking a soy latte, I get a double shot it goes through my body and you know I'm satisfied.
And what I love about Hail to the Thief is that it's more than just your average anti-Bush album. It's also a perfect blend of the alt-rock sound Radiohead perfected in their 90s output and the more electronic and avant-garde music they've been experimenting with for most of the 2000s. This album also contains some of the angriest songs Radiohead has written up until this point, like the opening track, 2 + 2 = 5, and They're There, which features Johnny Greenwood's most badass guitar riffs in any Radiohead album ever. This album proves that he's one of the best guitarists that just spends most of his time on stage smashing his guitar like crazy. Unless you're Tom Morello, I guess. You also have the more electronic cuts that would fit perfectly on Kid A and Amnesiac, like Backdrifts or Sit Down Stand Up, or as I and many fans like to call it, Thom Yorke singing about raindrops for 4 minutes straight. We also sorta get to hear Thom rap on the album closer, A Wolf at the Door, and you'd be shocked to hear that it's actually one of his finest vocal passages on any Radiohead song. Speaking of which, it's also kind of funny how the angriest song Thom apparently wrote for this album is also one of the shortest and simplest on the entire album, that being I Will, which is about Thom wanting to protect his children from the horrors of war and terrorism. It's a cool concept, honestly. But man, I wish it was expanded upon more instead of just coming off as a quick interlude. Which leads me to the same problem I have with this album that I also had with Amnesiac. and it's that some of these songs feel unfinished. Only this time, it's kinda worse here than it was on the last album, because now, the unfinished songs only make this album so much longer than it should be. And some of them just go on for fucking ever. We Suck Youngblood sounds like what would happen if Radiohead wrote a theme song for the movie Morbius. No, seriously, read these lyrics and don't tell me you don't imagine Jared Leto morbing out to this song. While the Gloaming sounds like an unfinished Kid A leftover, and Scatterbrain. Why is this song on here? It did not need to be on this album. Seriously. But honestly, I don't think the bloated runtime is that big of a deal to me, since this album kicks so much ass. It's a genuinely underappreciated album in the band's discography that stands as one of their greatest political statements to date, and one that's surprisingly gotten better with age. You guys ever stop to think that Bush was more than just a thief and that, oh I don't know, he's kind of an American idiot? Just spitballing here. In Rainbows is Radiohead's best album. Yes, even better than OK Computer. Allow me to explain why. I've always seen Radiohead as one of the most adventurous bands in all of music. They've always challenged what rock music could be. And sure, you could say that OK Computer was Radiohead doing exactly that. But here's the thing. Albums like Kid A onward saw the band move away from the alt-rock sound that made them so popular, and essentially just did whatever the hell they wanted by going in a more experimental direction with their music. And I think In Rainbows is the culmination of everything the band's been doing after the success of OK Computer. To start, this album is a lot more accessible compared to the band's previous works. And I say that literally because when this album first came out, Radiohead allowed listeners to buy a digital copy of this album for any price they wanted. This move was unheard of back in 2007. And one that would go on to revolutionize the age of streaming services and internet promotion. Plus that one time U2 uploaded their album into every iOS device ever in the hopes they'd have the same success. They didn't. And Radiohead makes up for this album being so easy on the ears by bringing in some of their wildest and most colorful musical moments to date. 15 Step literally starts this album with this in-your-face, quick, and noisy electro beat, with Thom having an existential crisis, as is tradition. You also have the haunting folk tune Faust Arp, the dark and groovy Reckoner that sounds like it would fit perfectly on a Beck album, the garage rock insanity of Body Snatchers, and who could ever forget Ed O'Brien yelling his own name out in cursive for some reason on Weird Fish's Arpeggi. And Nude and All I Need are just wow. I also love the melancholic vibes of the album closer, Videotape, which has all these lyrics that, for some reason, remind me of Walter White recording his confessions in the Breaking Bad pilot. To put it in a nutshell, In Rainbows is my personal favorite Radiohead album. I think it features the best performances from every member in any of their albums, featuring Thom's best vocal passages that range from sorrowful to anxious, Johnny's wildly creative guitar playing, and let's give some love to the drummer as well, Philip Selway. This man absolutely killed it on this album, and probably even more so in the band's live basement performance, which I highly recommend you check out if you haven't yet. I truly believe In Rainbows is the pinnacle of the band's experimental works in the 2000s, and I'm definitely not the only fan of this band who feels the same way. Oh yeah, this exists. This album's kinda boring, honestly. I get why some fans would consider this Radiohead's worst album aside from their debut. While I admire The King of Limbs for being a lot jazzier and more free-spirited than the band's previous works, my biggest problem with this album is that it has so little to say or offer in the grander scheme of Radiohead's discography. Aside from some genuine bangers like Morning Mr. Magpie or Lotus Flower or the closing track Separator, The King of Limbs is so uninspired, repetitive, and lifeless that this entire album almost feels like a filler arc in the band's career. If you've heard one song on here, then you've probably heard the band do a better version of it on one of their previous albums. Like honestly, if you want to hear a better album about nature or the environment or whatever, go listen to Bjork's Biophilia, or honestly just watch Avatar 1 and 2 instead. Or really just watch the live basement version of this album. It's way better than the studio version anyway. The band had fun making this album at least, and also it's short so it doesn't overstay its welcome. Philip Selway's drumming is also really good. You could say he's the MVP of this album, but yeah, not much else to say here. And also Thom Yorke dancing is the best thing to come out of this entire album. The King of Limbs? More like the King of Mid. Shots fired! And at long last, we finally reach Radiohead's most recent album to date, 2016's A Moon-Shaped Pool. Where do I even begin with this album? I guess I can say that this is the slowest album in the band's entire discography. Make no mistake that A Moon-Shaped Pool is an album that's a very lush and ethereal slow burner. Seriously, I had to listen to this album multiple times before writing about this one. The sound of this album is very intimate and laid back, and one that adds up for what is truly the most personal album Radiohead's ever made. While it still tackles certain socio-political themes like the dangers of climate change in the numbers, or social media, the mass media, and maybe even cancel culture to an extent on Burn the Witch, A Moon-Shaped Pool is very raw and emotionally crushing in its songwriting. And even more so since it's implied that many of the lyrics on this album were inspired by Thom Yorke's split with his late wife, Rachel Owen. And there are most certainly lots of songs on this album that somewhat allude to themes of loneliness, heartbreak, and regret. Daydreaming, Dex Dark, Glass Ice, Identikit, and fan favorite True Love Waits are all hauntingly beautiful tracks, made better by the use of orchestras and strings that guitarist Jonny Greenwood definitely had past experience with on his film scores. I also forgot to mention just how well the band's cover arts complement the sounds of their albums so well. In the case of A Moon-Shaped Pool, I can definitely feel the music on this album just sucking me away into this bleak and colorless whirlpool of nothingness, like I'm being transported somewhere between the sunken place from Get Out and the wormhole from Interstellar. Overall, I think A Moon-Shaped Pool is easily the most human-sounding Radiohead album, in the sense that it sounds more organic than the band's previous works, but it's also one of the most emotionally powerful ones at that. This is an album that musically strips bare the human heart, and if this ends up being the band's final album, then I personally wouldn't mind at all given just how much closure this provides for their entire discography. I can definitely see why this album is beloved among fans, and I can definitely see this one becoming a personal favorite of mine with many more listens down the road. And those are my thoughts on every Radiohead album so far. For a band as big as Radiohead, I think it's absolutely beautiful to see how much their sound has evolved over the years. Radiohead is one of the few musical acts that's maintained so much success over the years by constantly jumping from genre to genre, and I love how they're always challenging what rock music could be. They could have easily gone out as one-hit wonders, and hell, some people today still think of them as such, but instead, they chose to switch up their sound, and they've only gone better at it every single time. Fun fact, the band actually named themselves after a Talking Heads song, so seeing Radiohead get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by the Talking Heads frontman himself is a testament to just how much these guys have become just as legendary as the band that inspired them in the first place. And now that I've listened to every studio album in Radiohead's discography, I feel like I'm ready. I'm finally confident enough to ask out this girl I met on Tinder. Apparently she's also a big Radiohead fan too. Oh, she's gonna love what I have to say about In Rainbows. So as it turns out, this girl I went out with has only heard Creep and thought it was a pretty good song. Other than that, she knows absolutely nothing else about Radiohead. So I did what most Radiohead fans would do on their first dates. Make her listen to Kid A. She filed a restraining order on me by the end of the third track.